My name is Mike Terry. I'm the superintendent of Founders Classical Academies, and I'm here today with Jason Karos, our associate superintendent for academics. In one of our previous conversations, as I just jump right into this, I'm really interested to see where this goes today. We talked about our mission, and in particular, the knowledge and virtue part. That we're trying to, as we form human beings, to give them a broad, I think, and thorough knowledge base, but we also want to teach them what it means to be good people. But then we have this other part of our mission statement where we talk about preparing students to prosper in a free society. Now, last time we actually talked quite a bit about the word prosper. And we probably got into, I don't remember, I have to go back and look at it, but we probably got into a bit on what we mean by a free society. But I thought today we'd talk a little bit more about that, because when we actually talk about our pillars, we actually say knowledge, virtue, liberty. And that word liberty is not explicitly stated in the mission statement. And I know there's kind of a parallel structure. Pursue knowledge, promote virtue, and prepare students to live prosperous in a free society. So, but I do think we need to talk about it a little bit more.
Yes.
That's what I'm hoping that we can do today. Thinking back to the formation of our mission statement, I think your school at Louisville was really the first to use it in that way. Why do we say free society instead of explicitly mentioning liberty?
Well, I think because we live in the United States, right?
Yeah.
We have a document called the Declaration of Independence and a constitution that supports it, and we celebrate every year on the 4th of July our independence. We celebrate our Constitution in September and the Bill of Rights in December, and we cherish the liberties that we have. The idea that we live in a democratic republic, that we live in a free society. And we cherish our rights and the responsibilities that go along with them, and so therefore we believe that in order to really truly flourish and to live well, we have to have a free society.
Right.
We have to be a free people, and that's really what the root of the word liberal is, and liberal education, which is one of the ways that classical education is traditionally referred to, and it's rooted in the Latin word for liberty, right? So we're providing an education for students that frees them. Sometimes it's called a liberating education. So so then that begs the question: liberating from what, right? Well, liberating us from certainly government tyranny, maybe tyranny of other people, and then tyranny of our own vices, the things that hold us back from flourishing.
I think it's hard for us to imagine what it's like to live in a country that is governed, whether it's harshly or kindly, in a highly directed way. You have to do this, and you have to do it this way, and all the aspects of the culture direct the people to adhere to those rules, whatever they are. It's hard for us to imagine that because we've never lived unless we came from another country.
Right.
We don't really get it. I know I can say that for myself, coming from a family that's been in America for hundreds of years, even predating the Declaration and Constitution, when we were still under the rule of England. But I never lived that way.
Right.
And I think unless, like maybe your parents would understand the difference.
Yes.
And anybody who has an immigrant background probably would. I think that the challenge, though, in talking about this is there's so many different places we can go, right? And that's, I think, for any of us getting into this work, and particularly our work at Founders, because we're not just a classical school, we're not just a public classical school, but we're a classical school preparing students for life in a context, and that is America. Right. And so, fortunately, there's all sorts of things that have been written on our country. The one that we've picked for this conversation is The American Cause by Russell Kirk. And, I've got the paperback copy here, and Jason has his there. But this is a book that you love and highly recommend. So let's start there and talk about why Russell Kirk has something important to say to us and it is worth discussing as we think about education in an American context.
Okay. Well, I guess it'd be good to start with who is Russell Kirk.
Right.
So Russell Kirk, was an American intellectual, born in the early 20th century, passed away in the 90s, and served as a war correspondent during World War II, and then became known as an author and as a public intellectual. He wrote a decent number of books, many essays, myriads of speeches, and one of the books that he wrote after World War II in the late 1950s was The American Cause. And he was asked to write it by a friend, interestingly, because during the Korean War, there were soldiers that were taken as prisoners of war by the North Koreans, the communists, and they were brainwashed about Marxist ideology while in these prison camps and adopted that radical ideology. And so the concern was from some public intellectuals, hey, how is it that American GIs who are fighting for their country can be swayed in this way? There must be some kind of a deficit in American education. And so, and not just in schools, but among adults as well. And so he authored this book in the 50s, and then it was reissued after or maybe during the Vietnam War for a similar reason, and not just because of the prisoners of war, but because of the kinds of turmoil that we were experiencing as a country at that time. And then it's been reissued multiple times since then by a different publishing house in more recent times, ISI. I think one of the more recent printings came after what happened on September 11th with the terrorist attacks. And so it's sort of another maybe a watershed event that causes a nation to examine its principles. What do we believe? Why would people want to attack us the way they do? And so anyways, this book, was written as a primer on American civic economic principles. And it's just over 150 pages, not written for intellectuals necessarily. A high school student could read this book and understand it. But it's very, very rich, despite its brevity.
Yeah. And there are a couple things I want to add to that. And number one is that Russell Kirk has a particular view of America.
Yes.
And I think that's going to come out a little bit as we talk. We've referenced in different discussions his other important book, or one of his other important books, The Roots of the American Order.
Yes.
That shows that America just didn't spring up out of nothing. These ideas didn't come from nowhere, and they're not embraced lightly by our founding fathers. Mm-hmm. That they're part of a long history of progress towards the liberalization of the citizenry. Of the masses, because that certainly wasn't, for most of the world's history, the status of the everyday person. And so when he looks at that, and we don't have to get really into the roots of the American order today. I just wanted to put it out there as evidence that Russell Kirk has thought a lot, or had thought a lot about what this country means to the world, mm-hmm. and more importantly, what the ideas mean to the world.
Right. Well, I think it's important to consider roots. We don't have to talk about these specific roots now, but for any civilization, right, there are roots that go way, way back. And, Kirk points out in this book that some of them we don't even know because they've developed over thousands of years. And it's hard to pinpoint exact origins on certain kinds of traditions, practices, beliefs, and so on. Whereas others, it's very evident. When they came about. What were the core principles involved there. But on the flip side, when you see revolutions, whether it's in ancient times or modern times, what you have is individuals or groups of people with radical ideas that say, we don't care what came before us. Right. We believe in this, and it starts today. So, say like a dictator like Pol Pot in the 20th century who, declared that like today is day zero. Like this is year zero. It all starts now, or which echoed, some of the radicals from the French Revolution,
right.
Which I think probably to the vast majority of the people, if they really think about it, is abhorrent. You mean to tell me that you you just make it all up now. It just starts now.
Mm-hmm.
Forget about the inheritance. Forget about who came before us. All the men and women that have struggled through all kinds of things for centuries to give us what we have. None of that matters. What matters is what you think today. It's so prideful,
Right.
Yeah. And disgusting in a lot of ways, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's, I think, as you read The American Cause, and by the way, the other thing I was going to say about this is, it is short, but there's so much in it, and we'll talk about the way he starts and the categories in which he thinks about the principles of a free society, and we'll probably break this conversation up because there's a lot here to think about. But when you read the book, you realize he's confronting the issue of the day, and that's Marxism, and whether it's economic Marxism or social Marxism. He is clearly drawing a contrast. And while the French Revolution, of course, preceded Marxism and Hegel as well, and those names are going to come up a lot, I think, over the course of many of these conversations. And again, I'm no expert in it, but one of the things that I do understand about both of them, and Marx in particular, is that number one, utopia is possible, or at least that's the promise. And and Russell Kirk will address that utopian sort of interest that so many people have. But the problem with it, number one, is that it's relative. That what constitutes utopia for revolutionaries depends on who's in charge. And so in those sorts of societies, there are no principles. There's no real undergirding I think, set of convictions other than we were going to make society into our image, whatever that is.
Right.
Now, they're tools, and you can see that in the communist planks. You see that things like government education and central banks; those are just two tools that a revolutionary group will employ in order to reach their goals. But I think that, and I think it's fair to think about what he's saying about a free society, what the American Cause is really about, in contrast to that sort of tyranny, where everything is controlled, but yet it's just always defined in that moment by whoever is in charge. Also related to that is this idea that history is flexible. It's not leading somewhere. It's formed by our effort to get to utopia, and it's in this constant upheaval. It runs its course. It reaches the point where it can't go further, so you got to tear it down.
Right.
And 0 day happens again and again and again. And what I think we would argue is that if you want to have a free and just, enduring society, it's got to be grounded on something that's outside of us, that we're not just making it up. As we go.
Yeah, well, you've used the word utopia a couple of times now. I think it's important to say that word utopia, is a more modern word in one sense. It has Greek roots, and it literally means no place, right? And so, the first person to write about a so-called utopian society, although he didn't use this word, was Plato, right? In Plato's Republic, he came up with this idea and a vision of what he thought would be an ideal society. Of course, that never came to fruition, and I think many people would argue that he really didn't want that particular type of society to happen. He was speaking more about sort of the elements of the soul and how to create a just society. But other people after him certainly had visions of utopian societies, and they've all ended up in a very similar kind of way, which is, in violence, in mayhem, destruction, chaos. And in the 20th century, as in 21st century, there have been all kinds of books written about dystopian societies that come about when people try to unnaturally, create something new that they believe is, ideal. And again, the principles that Kirk talks about here, are not things that somebody just thought of yesterday, right? These are, we might say, tried and true in one sense, but they go way back. And he's called Burkean in some ways, and so that, like, Edmund Burke, the famous Englishman who wrote against the French Revolution, talked about tradition being so important. That these things that we take for granted today have been established over a very long period of time, and the good and true, beautiful elements of our culture, of our civilization, have to be preserved, right? In the one sense, before we make changes, we have to understand why those things came about, what is the good in them, and certainly if there are things that are not good in our civilization, we ought to improve them. So, being a traditionalist in this sense, or conservative in this sense of the word, conserving those good, true, and beautiful things, doesn't mean you don't change anything.
Right.
It's just you're not going to radically alter the fabric of society, which is really important. And by the way, might as well say something about the word culture, because I think this connects, closely to what you were talking about before. So we use the word culture all the time, and culture connects to these principles that we're discussing here. It also connects to, so let's say Marxism, in a way, because culture is rooted in a Latin word, cultus colere, and on one hand it refers to cultivating, like farming, agricultural, right, weaning, but the word cult relates to religion, and it relates to like your root, like the root thing that you believe in, and from which everything else flows. And so we have a phrase that's been popular for some time now, that, let's say, people will say, like, politics is downstream culture, or downstream of culture. In other words, like the cult, the thing that is your first principle that you believe in, impacts everything else that flows afterwards, not just in politics, but in your morality, right, in your religion, in your economics, in your whole, worldview. And so let's say for Karl Marx or Lenin or somebody like that, like they have a religion, they have a highest good, right, let's say. Right. Maybe they don't believe in, the God of Jews and Christians, for instance, but they have a North Star, they have a root, and that, impacts everything else that they believe and do, right? Has an impact.
Right.
Yeah.
The question always is, though, when you think about the way societies are set up, is who has the say about what the society is going to look like? And I think when you have a society that's driven by sound convictions, like clearly the communists have convictions, the Marxists have convictions. There's something that they're trying to achieve. Now, that might be impossible, and it might be evil in a certain way. Certainly, the means can be both of those things. But I think we are saying that there are principles that direct people towards the highest good.
Yes. And
we need to pursue those in this book. And I think it's important to talk a little bit more about what Russell Kirk's actually saying in the book. But one of the quotes that jumped out at me early in the book is that he says that a man without principles is an unprincipled man. A nation without principles is an uncivilized nation. And so, I think what he's saying is that, okay, you can have a single individual who lacks principles, and the impact of that single individual is going to be a certain thing, but it's going to be limited. And that's actually a feature of man that Russell Kirk talks about. He talks about our powers and limits to our human nature, and we can talk more about that. But then when you get a whole bunch of people that form a group that we would call a nation, and nobody has principles,
right?
At least not sound principles that are based on truth,
or conflicting principles.
Well, there could be that as well, but when they lack principles altogether, there's no way you can have a culture that directs them towards a good outcome or a good end. And I think that's an important reason why we talk about these principles, and we refer to them as founding principles because we've adopted those that are important to our country. But why we don't just take that phrase "prosper in a free society" lightly, because we know if we're not pursuing that, and it's not based on a moral, political, economic view of the way the world ought to work based on the truth that's been either discerned or revealed to us, that we're just going to go off the rails.
Right.
And I have my concerns. I'm not an end of the world alarmist. I'm a generally hopeful person, but you can see the rise and fall of civilizations throughout history, and there's no reason to think that somehow America is going to be different from all the other countries that came before us. We're human beings just like they were. We're no different. We might have thought about certain things a little bit more, but at the end of the day, if we aren't principled, we're going to go the way of every nation before us,
Yes.
every empire before us.
Yes. Well, as we talked about when we were discussing, the mission statement, and the motto, the founders were convicted about the fact that, a free people must be well educated, and they must be a moral people. They must be a virtuous people. Otherwise, they'll be subject to tyranny by necessity, right? For some of the reasons that you just described. So if you're an unprincipled person, right, you're like a ship without a rudder, right? You're like somebody on a journey in the wilderness without a compass, right? And if you just think about one of the purposes of education in general, it's to help to order yourself, right? You've got all of these ideas running around in your head, all of these kinds of things that animate you, whether you call them passions or something else, and something needs to help to focus you, to center you, right, and to lead you in the right direction, and these we call like principles, right, moral principles, in this case, right. And so if you just extend that out to the larger society, if there's no rudder for the ship, we're going to crash and sink, eventually. And I think here's the concern that Kirk and others had initially back in the 50s, and that I think many people have today. Let's face it. I think it's pretty common knowledge that there are not just lots of young people, but many adults that don't know the fundamental principles of this country. They know it in a general way. Like, I think there's a kind of an American spirit that you see in holidays like the 4th of July and so on, or like, the Olympic Games are going on right now. I think probably most Americans are proud when they see an American athlete getting a medal, doing well in the Olympics, right? There's a sense of patriotism there. But what is the deep root behind that? And so that if you were presented like these GIs were during the Korean War or Vietnam War, with an alternative explanation that doesn't just connect to your form of government, but really your whole outlook on life, what a community should be about, what a society should be, what are the roots for everything that you believe in? Like, could you really explain it and defend it? And here's the thing: like, if you, for instance, we have a problem in our country whereby knowledge of history is at a very low level, right? In large part because of what's been going on in schools, and not just history, but say civic education, right? And how do you love and cherish something that you don't know about? Right? You can love certain things about your culture, like the food we eat, the sports teams, perhaps elements of popular culture like music and film and so on. But that's not like a deep, really like deep-rooted affection.
Right.
That's more like an affection at the emotional level, right? But when you get to the core, like, what is this country about? Why should I love it? Why should I ultimately defend it? If it come to that, I need more than just tasting my apple pie. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you have a book like this. That's why we ought to have good education in general, but certainly a good education in the area of history and civics and economics and so on.
Yeah, I think it's important too. It's like, as you think about the holidays we celebrate as a nation, Memorial Day and Veterans Day are certainly about our war history. 4th of July is not just about a Revolutionary War. It's also about the reasons behind it. I think it's important for us to mention the ideas that really are at the heart of our culture. Yes. We talk about ideas like freedom and justice and privacy rights and even things like charity and love and duty and honesty. And so when you talk about culture, my hope is that it's a culture that is wrapped up in these ideas, that it's a culture that insists that people ought to be free to pursue their interests. And it doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want whenever you want. And Kirk actually addresses that.
Right.
The idea that you will be able to find justice for wrongs that are done to you, that people are going to leave you alone and your stuff alone and your place alone is in the privacy rights, but it's also going to be a culture that's concerned about caring for others.
Right.
And that's where he talks about charity, love, and duty. I mean, those three things are about how we interact with others and how we care for others. And hopefully our culture is not just about baseball games and movies and certain kinds of food. It's actually more about how we care for each other, and how we seek to raise our children in a place where they're going to thrive, where they're going to flourish. And our mission statement uses the word prosper. So I think it's important as we have continually referenced the idea of principles, that we talk a little bit about what those principles are.
Yes.
And that's something that I'm trying to encourage with our school leaders. And it's like, don't just say we promote a free society, but say, what is it about a free society that we want to encourage? What is it about our culture and our schools that we want to promote in order to get to that goal?
Yes.
Of being prepared and appreciative of a free society. So again, this was a short list that he provided in a larger category that he called moral principles. So he breaks the book down into basically three sets of convictions: the moral convictions, the political convictions, and the economic convictions. And I think we tackle the moral convictions a bit today, and we'll come back to the political and economic principles that we care about. So if you start with these basic ideas: freedom, justice, property rights, charity, love, duty, honesty, I think you have to talk about where they come from. And that's a big place, a big starting point for him.
Yes.
Where do you see, first of all, those principles finding their place in our schools? I mean, because ultimately we have to teach them.
Yes.
To our students, but also I'm curious to talk a little bit more about the source of them.
Right.
Like, how do we know they're real, that they're important, that they're legitimate?
Well, I think it's important to tap into Kirk's language here in this book, but then to extend outside of it a little bit. We said this is just a primer here. So thinking about classical education, we say in classical education often that what we do is rooted in a tradition. I think it's rooted in the Western tradition or Western civilization, which goes back thousands of years, right? It starts, with the Greeks and the Romans and the Hebrews, and it extends, beyond that. And so, like, the first thing to think about is, okay, these core principles, that we say undergird everything that we do, they do have a cultural civilizational root, right? Like, we can say it goes back to the ideas and the way of life of particular people, to thinkers, or to revelation, both, right? So oftentimes this is described as like Greco-Roman heritage and Judeo-Christian principles, right? And what does that like get us to in the context of your question? It gets us to the ton kalon, or the summum bonum that we talked about last time. There's a highest good, right? And natural law, right? The idea, and this is an idea that Thomas Jefferson, of course, alludes to in the Declaration of Independence, like the laws of nature, nature's God, right? The idea is that there are constants, not just in the universe, so that the cosmos is knowable, the natural world is knowable because there are these constants that we can observe and measure, but that in our own lives, there are constants. And one of those things is that, we have a certain dignity as human beings by virtue of our humanity. And we ought to be treated in a particular way. We ought to have certain rights and the responsibilities that go along with those rights, obligations that go along with those rights. And therefore, a government, in the case of the Declaration of Independence, ought to preserve those rights. A government ought to be working for the people. But when you have a democratic republic where the people are the government, that means the people have to be in a good working order. They have to understand, first of all, that they have a human nature, that we have dignity and worth, right? And that we all ought to be working to preserve life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, among others, right? And that entails a whole a whole lot of education, a whole lot of good living, with an understanding that as you pointed out before, we're here for the common good. But the idea of natural law, again, it just doesn't appear out of nowhere. It has a basis in, let's say, the Hebrew scriptures, has a basis in Greek philosophy, and then that idea is developed over a very long period of time, throughout our civilization, and we get to the flowering of liberty in Philadelphia in 1776 in this document, where it's expressed there, very beautiful, although not in great detail, obviously.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that's at the heart of what we're talking about here, that we have a nature, and with that comes a certain kind of worth and dignity, which is unique, actually, if you think about it, in the history of the world. If you just look outside of the scope of the civilizations that I just described, that's a rare understanding, whether it's in religion or in philosophy. Mm-hmm. Right? You have some elements of it, let's say in some Far Eastern philosophical thought. It's not greatly developed, in a systematic way, but you see it, for instance, like in Taoism, and C.S. Lewis, of course, connects to the Tao, what he calls the Tao or the Tao, and abolition of man. And that's a really interesting investigation. Mm-hmm. One could go on. But ultimately, as I mentioned before, if you think about like the root of culture, it's the cult. These kinds of principles are rooted in a religious faith, ultimately in philosophy. And that doesn't mean, in thinking about we as leaders in the classical charter school movement here, and the founders' array of schools, we're not saying that we're promoting a specific religion on our campuses, or that everybody has to be part of some religious group or church. But what we're saying is that, look, if you live in the United States, you're living in a society that has inherited something. Many of the fundamental building blocks of our civilization, our culture, is rooted in these ideas, including our laws and our ideas of justice. Right? Like our whole justice system is rooted in. If you go to the Supreme Court and other court buildings, what are the kinds of symbols that you see up? You see like Moses holding 10 commandments or something like that. That's there for a reason. Not that there aren't other symbols, right? Because laws have connections in different areas, but it's an important thing to say, from the start.
I think, though, that's unfortunately a controversial thing to talk about right now. Mm-hmm. And by right now, I just mean over the last 30 years. Mm-hmm. In Louisiana at the moment, they've required all classrooms to display the Ten Commandments. Okay. There are a lot of people that are taking umbrage at that. They're offended by that. I'm curious. When you talk about these moral principles that we value, freedom, justice, privacy rights, charity, love, duty, and honesty, which again, this is Russell Kirk's list. I think we could probably come up with some other things as well, right? We're saying that these ideas are rooted not just in a tradition which suggests, well, we've just kind of always done it, so therefore we should just keep doing it. Seems to be working for us. But we're saying that these are connected to the transcendentals that we talked about last time: truth, mm-hmm. Beauty, and goodness. What do you say? And I've had this question proposed to me as well. What do you say when somebody says, well, those are fine. They from a pragmatic standpoint, they seem to be good for us, but you can't connect those to God. You can't prove that they're associated with the desire of the Almighty. Mm-hmm. I think Kirk seems to take that as a presupposition in his book. Takes it, I won't say for granted, because that makes it sound like he's taking it lightly, which he doesn't. But when somebody says to you, well, these are good ideas, but there are other ideas that are useful as well, like fairness, mm-hmm. and equity, and not to pick on buzzwords, but that everybody should have the same thing, and that the money ought to be distributed equally among people. Those are good ideas too, and why shouldn't we include those in this sort of list? Why are we saying these ideas are special? I mean, how do you respond to a parent who brings an argument like that to you?
Well, first of all,
and by the way, it might not just be a parent. I'm not saying that we have parents that are trying to go against what we're promoting.
Right.
But this is a common argument.
Well, I think it's important to say from the start again that as a organization that is operating classical charter schools, we're not promoting a religion. We're not worshiping with students in school.
Right.
What we're saying is that we've inherited a civilization, a tradition, a way of educating that is rooted in something, right? And that's just the reality. I mean, we can dismiss it, we can ignore it, but it's there. If you just look at all the great works of literature, of philosophy, and so on that are considered like the seminal text, and I know there are new texts, right, that might one day be on that list, but just thinking about the ones that most people consider to be the classics, right? I mean, most of them are written, during the last couple thousand years, and the ideas that we're discussing and Kirk discusses are in them, whether directly or indirectly, right? It's just part of the sort of the flow, of ideas and principles, and so it's important to say that, and so if a parent were to come to me and say, well, these principles are found in other places, well, I think going back to Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis has a list in the back of that book that includes all kinds of principles and moral elements that are found universally around the world. Right? Now, he's not saying he wasn't a universalist. He wasn't saying that all faiths and philosophies are the same, but he's saying there's something inherent in humanity, right, when it comes to these kinds of things that we all ought to be paying attention to, right? And I think for C.S. Lewis, he would say, well, they're inscribed in our hearts and minds, right, by a creator ultimately. But whether you believe that or not, that doesn't mean that you can't receive a beautiful classical education and thrive in many ways in this civilization, right? So I'm not sure I can't remember exactly how you framed that question, but I think that's one of the things I'd say. Yes, yeah, you're right. I mean, there are principles that are universal. I have no qualm, with that. But again, we live in the United States. If we lived in Japan, for instance, right, they have a different history. They have a different set of influences, especially before modern times when they were highly influenced by Western civilization after World War II. Yeah. But like their religious tradition is different. Their philosophical principles, are specific to Japan. Their way of life has many beautiful and interesting, elements that are not part of, say, culture in the United States. And so the education there has historically looked different, and it ought to be, right? Although, again, there'll be some universals that we would see in both, right? So I don't know. Maybe I've just kind of digressed there, but maybe if I haven't answered your question, maybe I can come back to it.
Well, I think that's a good start. Kirk talks about that in order for these things to be real, and he believes they're real, freedom, justice, et cetera, that I mentioned, that they've got to come from somewhere that's outside of us, and that's a big part of the debate. Are we it? Is our material being all there is, right? Or are we spiritual beings? He talks about a spark of immortality that we all possess. When I've had this question posed to me, though these are good ideas, the question I ask the person is love real? Can you in your mind think about a world without love? Can you think about a human experience that you would want to be a part of where love isn't a reality? And I think most people, assuming they're not too cynical, will acknowledge that they don't understand love, but they know it exists. They know it when they have it, and they know it when they don't. and they can imagine what a loveless society would be like. And I think our experience, right, tells us a little bit, but also our intuition tells us that these things are real. I mean, and Kirk and his perspective in the book, particularly when he's talking about moral convictions, he's got categories and he's got ways of thinking of it, and he talks about our perspective about our existence and the inclination we all have towards worshiping God. Now that, like you said, that looks different in different societies, but it's there on a certain level, and the way he looks at God is that God is a father, the way the Judeo-Christian tradition and maybe the Muslim tradition. I don't know enough about it to say that whether they look at him as father or not, but that father, that metaphor, father, and maybe it's literal and maybe it's a metaphor, is that there's somebody there teaching us, leading us, showing us the way, the way we think of a father to our children, and that father has norms, that they're both prescriptive and proscriptive, meaning that they're both positive and negative, things you do and things you don't do. We talk to our students from time to time about the importance of understanding the way we are meant to function. You have, especially with the older, maybe more sophisticated ones who say, well, this works for me or that works for me. It's like, well, look, the idea that you have to be honest in a useful way, like our think posters talk about, right. That you have to be charitable to one another. That's not a this works for you, that works for me sort of thing. That is a guide by which, if we want to flourish, we have to follow. So he emphasizes, and these are things that stood out to me, the fatherhood of God, and by personalizing God the way the Judeo-Christian faith does, this relationship means that we can trust these norms that we either discern or that are revealed to us. He talks about the brotherhood of man, and that, I think, gets into who we are in relation to one another. There's this idea going around today that we're all of different stuff, that our experience, our ethnicity, or whatever the category we're put in makes us somehow different from one another. And he emphasizes that no, we all suffer through this life. This life is hard, easier for some of us than others, but we all have had our suffering, that we're all precious to God. He's arguing that we're equals in terms of our creation and our nature. And while we may find a different status as we go through our lives than others, the point is that in his view, we're all the same. And then the third category he talks about there that I found really interesting, which gets into natural law, is the dignity of man. And he starts that by saying, we all have the spark of immortality that I mentioned earlier, and because of that, and because of where that comes from, we're all worth a measure of respect. And obviously, our how we conduct ourselves impacts our reputation and the extent to which we're respected by others. But just in terms of when you're looking at another person and thinking to yourself, am I going to extend charity to that person? Well, are they a human being like me? Do they contain that divine spark the way I do?
Right.
Love your neighbor as yourself is the idea. And then from that, this idea of inalienable rights, natural law, that these aren't rights that are just granted to us by the government.
Right.
They come from God and they can't be taken away. And I know that there are many people in our society that have to throw, just the way they think, they have to throw all this out. Because if you're saying that there's no God, then there's no basis for any of this. There's no basis for a principled interaction with another person. There's no basis for caring for another, except some maybe selfish inclination that, I better be nice to you because you may come and get me while I'm sleeping if I'm not. You know, and so that's just a self-preservation. That's not about seeking the good. So those things stood out for me, and of course that leads right into the conversation about natural law,
Right.
which I thought the way he draws out Edmund Burke's ideas were really interesting.
Yes. Yes.
I know that's a lot to say, but you know, when I'm reading this book, it's exciting. You know, the way he's categorizing the way we should think about, even in this case, just moral convictions.
Right. Well, I think what part of what you described kind of gets to the point of subjectivity, right? So, if there is a God, if there is a highest good, right, then these kinds of things that we're talking about are objective, right? It's not based on our whims. But if there is nothing, if there's no ton kalon, let's say, then it really is a matter of my opinion versus yours.
Right.
Like I create my own world, I create my own worldview, the principles that I want to follow or that I want to impose on other people, right? And that's again going back to the disorders that we were talking about before in certain times of history. But I think whether you're talking about Plato or Paul in the New Testament, or a modern political thinker from the founding generation, you have a common thread that connects to natural law, to be sure, and that is we want to create harmony within individuals and harmony between individuals and within a society. And so there are certain things that we ought to believe. There's certain ways in which we ought to live well. And when we have this knowledge, and we have this set of principles and virtues, and we have a modicum of self-control, then we can live well with other people and have a just society. Because all the beautiful principles, the civic principles that we think about, whether it is, and these are the three big ones that Kirk talks about, ordered liberty, justice, and freedom, right, and equality even. Like you can't have those things if there's not a type of harmony within a person and harmony between people, right? Even if you think about them and want them, it's just not going to work. There's going to be chaos, right? And so that's why it's important to start first in this discussion with the principles. Like, what are the things from which everything else flows, right? And of course, when reading a primer like this, it's helpful to know that, look, Russell Kirk was a man of letters. Like, he was, the kind of education that he had is very unique. He knew about ancient philosophy. He knew about history. He wrote histories. He knew literary works. He knew theology. And so he is, he's putting together this work in 150 pages, more or less, to lay out the principles for the American cause. But it's all built upon something, very rich, very deep and broad, at the same time.
How do we get this across to our students?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I'm looking at my notes here, and because that's the way I approach these sorts of conversations, and I'm looking at, I've got kind of this progression of natural rights that I draw out of the book, and he talks about John Locke, and of course, you can get into Leviathan, and Locke wrote volumes as well, and he's boiled down to life, liberty, and property. Mm-hmm. Then you have Thomas Jefferson come along and say, well, let's say life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, because, well, property is just, maybe that sounds selfish, or maybe that's going to create problems for groups in our country who don't have access to property rights. Which, by the way, on that, you think about the history of Europe, and nobody owned anything. Like, we think that that the lords, the wealthy in what small sliver of society in Europe was in that category. We think, well, they own vast tracts of land, but it's not true. I mean, nobody owned the lands but the kings, and they were granted based on their title a land lease, and they couldn't sell it. They couldn't divide it among their sons, which created all kinds of family problems, and so. Locke and the restoration of the the British throne and the establishment of the British Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, at the end of the 17th century, was certainly thinking about the importance of these ideas, but still, to boil it all down to life, liberty, and property, and Thomas Jefferson, life, liberty, and happiness, it's probably simple for our students. But when you get into natural law or you get into founding principles, it's much broader than that.
Yes. Well, I think it's important to say something about property because many of the founders wrote about the link between property rights and liberty, right, and investment. So many people did own property, at least small plots of farmland, in the early period of the United States, right? When you own property, you could then become a voter if you're of a certain age and so on with the other qualifications, and you have a stake in things.
Right.
This is my land. I farm it. I live on it. I cultivate it. It impacts my soul, right? Therefore, you're more fully invested in the civic process, right? And so this is why property is so significant. And it wasn't just John Locke. Other founders that wrote, say, statements for their colonies for independence, or when they were drafting their early state constitutions, might have used, like Mason and others, the word property, right? But pursuit of happiness, the beautiful thing about pursuit of happiness that Jefferson expresses there is that it's broader, and it doesn't just mean emotional. It doesn't. In fact, that's a lesser thing. It doesn't mean emotional happiness per se, right? The word happiness philosophically and theologically relates to your well-being as a human being. That means that you're living well. You're living as a human being in terms of the virtues, right? So in other words, you have the right to pursue the good life according to the Declaration of Independence, and the government ought to protect that right. Now, that includes farming your land, owning your business, raising your family, and prospering in that sense, right? But it's much bigger than that, and that's the beauty of it, right? And just going back to the sort of the religious, connection. I think many people know about the Sermon on the Mount from the couple of the Gospels and what are called the Beatitudes, right? I mean, the Beatitudes start with the word in English, blessed, blessed are, right? Like blessed are the poor in spirit, or blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That word in the New Testament comes from a Greek word, makarios, which means happy. So in other words, if you're living well, if you're living virtuously, you are happy. Even though you might be suffering, even though your crops may have gone bad because of whatever disaster, but because you're living well, you're a person of virtue, then you are truly happy.
Yeah.
This is the idea. And that life's pursuit ought to be protected, among other things.
Right. And I think in our schools, we work to challenge our students on those ideas. What does it mean to live a happy life? I think that's an important question. Kirk talks about Edmund Burke's view of natural law, and you mentioned Burke already, and you see that sort of formula. Do these things and you'll be happy, although he doesn't word it that way. But so I extracted a list that Kirk puts in here of those precepts, and I think they're simple and they make sense, but we need to understand that they are coming out of that idea of human dignity.
Right.
So if we have dignity, then we should expect our society to be just, that we should be able to understand what the laws are, that they're not so complicated that you're always in danger of breaking a law. I don't know if it was during one of the recent administrations, but the president at some point had gone to whatever office in the government kind of evaluates the register, the Federal Register, which lists all of the different regulations that are required, and basically wanted to know like how many laws or not laws, because that's established by Congress, but how many regulations were there in the registry, and how many of them could result in some type of punishment, like a fine or imprisonment.
Mm-hmm.
And the response from whatever office, handles that was, we don't know and we can't know.
Mm.
And that's a violation of the rule of law. Right. So it's impossible for either one of us to know for certain that what we're doing is permitted
right.
in our country. And that's immoral, because we're always living in fear that we're going to break some rule. He talks about doing justice. We've talked about that already. The idea that wrongs will be righted properly, and each will get what is due him or her.
That might be an important place to interject something.
Sure, go ahead.
And of course, we're going to get into justice and maybe in another conversation, because that's a whole topic that he gets into as being one of the three pillars, of sort of the American civic ethos. But what the question is, like, justice versus fairness, right? The word fair or like equitable, is often used today. Well, what does that mean? Like when I think of the word fair, I mean, it can have a good connotation to be sure, like let's treat people fairly, or that's not fair, like a small child might say, if somebody takes something from him, right? But justice, is an ancient word that has philosophical and theological roots that really matters. And the word deals with what you just talked about in the short phrase that you use there. Treating people justly means that you're rendering to each person what is due to him or her, right? Which obviously you have to unravel that, but like in every case, that means you have an obligation to treat that person justly, fairly even, right? Because he's a human being, because he has dignity and worth. And yes, there are laws as well that apply in some cases, or rules in a school, that might also sort of substantiate the larger point. But there's a kind of a subsidiary principle, though, beyond just treating somebody, according to the way he or she deserves. And that is to treat equals equally and unequals unequally in proportion to their inequality. This is a very ancient way of thinking about justice. And what I mean by that is, if let's say in a household you have two children, one teenager and one elementary age child, you might lay down a rule of behavior in a certain circumstance. Right. If both of them break it at the same time, you provide a consequence as a parent, but the consequence for the older, more mature, and supposedly responsible child might be more significant than the younger child's. And the older one might say, well, that's not fair. Well, no, that's perfectly just, right? Because you, as the 17-year-old, know better, and you should be setting an example for your younger sibling, right? So it's not about total equality, right? Justice isn't about total equality of outcome or treatment, right? It's there's a circumstance there that permits a different outcome, but the justice principle is in place, right? There was a rule established, a rule was broken, there ought to be a consequence, right, for a variety of reasons, but it's not an equal consequence in this case, but a just one, right? Yeah.
Well, I think that example is interesting because it suggests that, because we talk about forming human beings, the more you're formed, in the sense of things, and that you understand what you ought to do, the expectations are higher.
Yes.
And so that's I think, while like in our schools we would afford more freedoms or liberties to our older students, but they also have to demonstrate they can handle it.
Right.
The smaller children can't just run about the campus because there's cars driving through and they don't pay attention, or they're not aware, of the power of the vehicle. Whereas we can see that as our students have grown, that by the time they're in high school, they can handle those responsibilities. So on the one hand, and I think Kirk does bring that out, that and it certainly Edmund Burke does, that where as you live out the freedoms, like if you for example expect to be able to take advantage of charity, that you have to be willing to provide it to others.
Yes.
Those things come about as you grow and learn. I mean, we try to teach that to the little ones, but it takes them a while to really figure out what
Right.
we mean by that. So I think that's an interesting example. He also talked about, and a couple of these to me get really interesting because they get into the idea of property rights, but he doesn't say it that way. So he talks about the right, that we have the right to the fruit of our labor. I think that's an essential idea.
Yes.
Because from that comes this twofold thing. One is this right to live, the right to life that we should be able to provide for ourselves and reap the benefit of what we provide, but also the recognition that work is hard.
Right.
And that when you work hard and you produce something, the government shouldn't come in and take it away from you. There's a lot of memes going around right now about how the Revolutionary War was fought over a 2% tax, and we completely ignore the fact that now we're being taxed up to 40-50% depending on where we live. It's like we don't care that somebody is coming in and taking away the fruits of our labor. It's a little disturbing. I don't know why we're so quiet about it, but I guess it's been that frog in the pot. Like we just got used to it and don't question it.
Right. Well, I think it's. I mean, it's again. It just again goes back to maybe a lack of knowledge, right? A lack of knowledge about the principles that we're describing. The authority that government ought to have both at the local, state, and federal level, and then the historical connections. Yeah, what were those guys struggling for
Right.
In the 18th century, and how is it similar or different than the way we're living today?
Yeah.
And what should we be concerned with? Right?
And there's a corollary to that that right to the fruit of their labor, and that's also the means to make labor fruitful.
Right.
So this idea that there's certain things that I have to have, like food and water and shelter, and that nobody has the right to stop me from possessing those things. Now I've got to do it lawfully, because we've already talked about the rule of law and justice, and that includes not coming to your house and taking your things,
Right.
because I think I might need it, but you have the right to possess and defend those things, which has certainly been another one of those conversations, like the riots of 2020, where business owners were told you shouldn't defend your livelihoods because you can replace those things. Well, maybe they can't, and isn't that irrelevant anyway?
Right.
That they spent their lives building something, and if they want to continue it, they can't have you smashing in their windows and taking their stock that they're going to use to build this microphone or whatever else they need to do what they do.
Yeah, Kirk talks about another element of that, which is economic incentives and disincentives. So in the later chapters on the economic topics, the idea is, look, if you know that you're going to produce a certain amount of work, and that 3/4 of the earnings of it will be confiscated from you, that's a disincentive for you.
Right.
To provide the kind of output that you do, which then not only has a harmful impact on you and say your immediate family, but the larger community that might rely on the fruits of your labor in some way, whether it's through trade or something else, right? So getting into like the principles of a more market economy versus an authoritarian, a command economy or something, right? Yeah. So which is, again, going back to the business owners whose maybe shops were damaged or looted. Like, what incentive do you have to reopen if you don't believe that the authorities are going to protect
Right.
your property and your rights as an owner of a business?
Right, and that's actually a whole scenario that Hazlitt gets into in economics in one lesson, and second and third order effects that
Yes.
that governments don't think about, and I believe that is a book our students read.
Yes, senior year.
Yeah, because I think that's important. Several other of the rights that Burke talks about is the right to inheritance. I can provide for future generations through my hard work. That the government isn't going to take that away, and that's something that we're struggling with right now. I mean, the federal government is trying to change the rules on inheritance and this idea of present value, and that basically everything you have, or a large portion of it, should kind of belong to them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, it's frightening, and it gets even more serious if Burke can think about also the right to care for our children, and he's thinking about societies where the government feels that the children belong to them and not families.
Mm-hmm.
That's a significant infringement. He also, this other one was curious to me when I was reading it. He listed consolation in death. Like he's got all these ideas that directly relate to how we live, and then there's this one, consolation in death. And I had to think about that for a while. I was like, what is he talking about? Consolation in death. And to me, what it really meant is the right to see God.
Mm.
And maybe he's got a different view of what he means by that, but we have the right to ask others to pray for us, that we have the right to, on our own, without government telling us what we can and can't do. You think, well, that no government does that. Well, of course they do. I mean, that was the way of the Soviet Union for 80 years. There is no God, and you can't find him. I think about how hopeless those people must have felt, but it probably didn't stop them. I mean, the church didn't die
Right.
during the Soviet Union, and then the last one was that he noted, and these are all under those things that we have a right to, and it was education. And he wasn't that concise about it. He had more to say, but the right to learn,
Right.
that we can't be told that this is all you need to know.
Yes.
So that's kind of the list that Russell Kirk synthesized from Burke, and then he talked about responsibilities. Do you have any views on any of these that would be good to talk about now? And we're going to have a couple more conversations on this book.
Right.
I think.
Well, there's a lot to unpack.
There is, and I just glossed over them.
Yes. Well, and I think ending with education is kind of good because it brings us full circle back to the mission. What is it that we're trying to do? Like all of these principles could sound sort of highfalutin in some ways, unless they're really activated in people's minds and hearts, right? You have to know what they are, why they're significant, and what it looks like in everyday life in a society. And that is one of the major purposes of K-12 education. And that's part of what we mean when we talk about preparing students for prosperous lives in a free society. Being in a position to know and to live well. And as we talked about, I think the first time as well, we talked about establishing a normative education. Like, here are the things that we all ought to know and upon which we should be formed when we're children. And then obviously as adults, we begin to experience this dialectical reality that happens as we come in contact with other ideas. And then we, mull them over and have hopefully great civic discussions with our family, neighbors, and others, which is one of the rights we have here: freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and participation and influence.
So we don't have a clock in here, so I have no idea how long we've been talking. I don't even know when we started.
Over an hour.
What was it? Okay, so Shannon's back there, and she pressed the record button and said, "Go ahead and start talking." And I think she's still back there. She hasn't left the room. Oh, I see a hand, so she's still there. And so I think we will wind this conversation down with this part of it here. However, you did say there that there's about education, that we're trying to help students understand what to do and what not to do, or what to do, and also what's expected from them in terms of their responses to other people. So I just want to run through this kind of list of to-dos, this master list of to-dos one more time, but then I just want to make sure before we close it that we talk about the responsibilities. So some of these principles that we talk about. Now, we can also make some differentiations between Edmund Burke and maybe what we might call founding principles, but I think these are all in the same ballpark here. And certainly Russell Kirk says these are all part of the American cause. So he said rule of law, justice, both doing it and seeking it for others, the rights to the fruits of our labor, means to make labor fruitful, right of inheritance, right to care for our children, consolation in death, or in my view, the right to seek God, the right to seek an education. Those are the things that, among others that we could talk about, that Burke thought were important. But he also said, you shouldn't do what is unreasonable. So we can talk a lot about the COVID lockdowns and how we should take care of each other, and we should protect grandma and all these things. But there's also the idea of, well, what's reasonable as we're trying to protect our elderly and look out for one another? Is it reasonable to shut businesses down for the length of time that they did? Is it reasonable to isolate the children from one another? So that he's calling on us to think about these things, right? What is reasonable? He says you should work if you're able. We talk about the Protestant or American work ethic, depending on how you want to frame it. You have to respect the lives of others. That gets the dignity question. But not just that we don't strike someone down or humiliate them or make their lives difficult, but that we're seeking their good, their best for them. I think that's important. Our students need to hear it. Respecting our others' property. I think you talk about, as we walk through your campus on your tours, about how there aren't locks on the lockers.
Right.
We've taught the students to respect each other, right? I think that's kind of a funny example. It's like, it's just lockers. Who cares? But that's a major source of conflict among students.
Right. And
yet, we don't put lockers on a lot of the lockers, and the kids don't cause problems because they respect each other.
Yes. Well, I think there's an axiom, that goes back to ancient times, ancient Greece in particular, that says, without order, there's no liberty. Right. So if you can get a culture, a civilization to the point where the people understand that it's good to have order, right? And once you have that established, then people can truly be free, right? They can live their lives in the ways they want to. In harmony with others. They don't have to fear vagrancy and all kinds of concerns all the time, right? So it's the same in school. Like if students know that they can come to school and not be beaten up or their things taken from them or whatever it is, then I don't have to put a lock on my lock. I'm not worried about somebody stealing something or damaging my belongings, and I can focus on other good elements of school, which of course is learning and friendships and so on.
Well, I think that speaks to the importance of what we promote at our school, and that when students come to our schools, hopefully they have once they learn what the expectations are, they have a sense of peace. Like they're not on edge because they don't know where the next threat is going to come from. And anybody who thinks there aren't threats in high schools, probably didn't go to high school, because we all lived through that. One of the things I like about these conversations with you is that I've got to take all these notes, and I can always count on you to tell us what the word is and where it's from, and it's just there, it's in your head, and I'm scribbling things down and taking notes. Maybe my journalism background coming out a little bit, but I love the way these ideas and these writers, and I certainly learn a lot when we have these conversations.
Well, a lot already, but the good thing about your notes is that it keeps us on track.
Okay.
I think the conversation might go all over the place if it wasn't for your organization and note taking there.
I do what I can. It's mostly to keep me on track so that I can follow the conversation, but I think that what we'll do is stop there, and then the next time we talk, we'll come back to a discussion on political convictions. Maybe we can get Kirk's ideas on political convictions and economic convictions done in a single conversation.
Perhaps, yeah.
We'll see. And then, of course, you had mentioned that there's an additional piece of work in this book that's worth discussing as well.
Yes, yeah. So Gleaves Whitney, he wrote both the introduction and the afterword to the edition I think that both of us have here, and the afterword is it really emphasizes a topic that, especially over the last however many years, might seem a little bit taboo. It's called the American achievement, and some people might say, oh, is that something like American exceptionalism, right? And yeah, it is along those lines. But he's a Russell Kirk scholar, Gleaves Whitney is, but he basically again in the same vein as what Kirk's trying to do here is to show people, look, let's just step back from the politics. Let's step back from the ideology and look at the history and the influences that Western civilization and the United States has had on the world, and see what kind of wonderful achievement this really is, despite all the scars, despite all the negatives of the human condition that we faced for our 250 year or so history. Right? It's a beautiful short afterwards. It really is. Yeah.
Good. I look forward to talking about it. I will say in conclusion, if you've made it this far in this conversation, congratulations. If you don't have this book, Russell Kirk's The American Cause, and hopefully you can see it from whichever camera view we're on right now. I strongly encourage you to get it. ISI is the source, and that's the Intercollegiate Studies Institute,
Yes.
and you can find them online at isibooks.org. I strongly recommend that you pick up a copy and go through it. I think it's worth the read. So I think we'll stop there.
That sounds good.
And we'll pick the conversation up again.
All right. Till
All right.
then.